He has been an expert on this field. He knows in depth what it is, and it'll inform you. Actually, he gave that talk once before, and I think many of you were enriched by his presentation. I certainly believe that he will be equally inviting as well as entertaining and informative as before. So I'd like to turn this over to him. The 1918-1919 Spanish influenza and our own COVID-19, which is changing everything. Professor, it's yours.
Thank you, Sal. Now that's a lot to live up to. I have to be entertaining and informative. One would be difficult enough, but both, that may be quite a bit. Well, good morning, everyone. I have been with you before. I've been with the association before, and I realize, of course, the World War I Association is principally a history group, and I am going to start out talking about the history, and then I will veer off, if you will, into the virology a bit so that we can explain exactly what it is we were dealing with in 1918, and of course the parallel, the similar disease we're dealing with now. Well, first of all, for those of you, I see a lot of gray hair out there. So if I mention John Wayne, you'll certainly know who he is. And if you're interested in the military, John Ford's wonderful trilogy, the Cavalry trilogy, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, the middle movie. John Wayne is a broken down old cavalry soldier. He was a colonel in the Civil War. And we're now on the plains fighting Indians. It's the 1880s. He's about to retire after a 40-year career. And his specialty is training young lieutenants. And he has a set of rules that they should live by. And the first rule is never apologize. You do what you're going to do, you move ahead, you don't apologize. I am going to break that rule. Let me start by apologizing. First, to really understand what's happened here, you need an historian. I am not an historian. Secondly, you need a virologist and probably a developmental virologist because of the layered development of the viruses we have and what goes on. I am not one of those either. My training is as a lawyer and a policy analyst, and during my career, I would bill myself at the War College. I was a strategist. I'm interested, as you know, you've heard talks with me before, I'm interested in strategy. So I approach this problem, this subject, from a strategic point of view. And this starts, my study, my interest starts some time ago, about 6 months ago, in looking at the effects the pandemic had on the war, and of course the conclusion of the war. So my research question was, did the evolution of the pandemic measurably affect the war, and did it drive us? If you look at the dates, you know, April of 17, we have the first, April of 18, we have the first real serious effect of disease. And of course, by September, it's all over the Allied front. It's all over the civilian population of the Allies and the Entente. And does this affect ending the war? Do we go to armistice because we weren't able to fight on either side? That was the question. So I and my research assistants have been working on that. By the way, I don't have the final answer. I think I know what the answer is, but a good scientist, we try to maintain, only lawyers give you the answer first and then come up with the reasons. A good social scientist, we wouldn't do that. So I have a professional conflict there. Well, that having been said, probably the greatest strategist in the 19th century and the person who drives what we do in military strategy today was a German general, a Prussian general, General Field Marshal Helmut Bernhard Karl von Moltke. And von Moltke, it's been mistranslated as no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Well, plans involve people. Is your army ready, willing, able to fight, appropriately equipped? You make a plan to do something. Now, what von Moltke actually said was that no detailed plan survives contact and collision with the main force of the enemy. It was mistranslated. So if we think about the strategic effect of the use of people in fighting a war, if you lose a significant amount, and I'll give you your first number here, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet in 1918. Before this ended in 1920, 500 million, almost 1/3 of the world's population had been infected with this disease. 500 million, one third of the planet. So this was extremely significant, the most significant pandemic in modern times. So we have a great deal to look at in terms of what was the effect on military production, what was the effect on the troop readiness in fighting the war that last 5 or 6 months that were very critical in terms of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Belleau Wood, and a number of other battles, the changing of lines and pushing the German army back out of its trench line. So it had to fight a war of maneuver at the very end, which had not been done since the first 2 months or so of the war when we settled into the trench war. So that's the strategic question. That's why I got involved in this, how I became interested. Well, what happened? What happened? First of all, let me talk about the origins of this, and then I'm going to come back to America specifically. We think there are, at this point, we're not sure, there appear to be 3 possibilities for the pandemic arising. The first is northern France in 1917, about a year before the outbreak we see in the United States. In northern France, a British garrison came down with flu-like symptoms that seemed to be more persistent, more pernicious than we had seen otherwise. This was a swampy area in which the French farmers raised a great number of pigs. And I'll talk about pigs and what that has to do with this a bit later. So that's the first time we see something recorded within Western militaries. That we get this 1917, sometime around the end of the flu season, which is January to April. So March, April, we start to see this 1917. It's significant, but it's not terrible, but it is significant. In Southeast Asia, we have the flu, a significant flu-like, annual flu-like symptoms arising. And we don't address this a great deal in the literature, but about 180,000 Chinese workers came to the Western Front assisting the Allies under contract. They were civilian workers. They worked as stevedores. They worked in building various things. Lots of new things were invented because of the circumstances of the ground upon which we operated. The trenches flooded. And of course, the 17 and 18 were the coldest winters, the coldest, wettest winters Europe had experienced in almost 50 years. And with the chewing up of the ground, with artillery, with the rains, the mud was a significant factor in transportation and operations. So we developed what's called duck boards. And duck boards were wooden planks that were put into the trenches about a foot above the bottom of the trench. So the water, as it filled up the trench, the waters could flow underneath. And behind the trench lines, the walking areas, you wanted to keep troops on these duck boards so that they would not slip into the mud. Now that doesn't sound particularly significant. Why is that a problem? Well, the mud was so serious that after shell holes, and we moved back and forth, so the shelling of the area is not just on the trench, but of course no man's land between the enemy and friendly trenches, but the area behind the trenches for several miles were so denuded by the continuous artillery shelling that large holes developed. They filled with water, and of course it wasn't able to drain after a significant time during the rainy seasons. Troops actually fell down in these shell holes and drowned either in the water or in the mud because of the clay soil being very slick. They weren't able to get enough traction to get up. Horses died, men died. We lost trucks that went into these shell holes that we couldn't pull out because tow vehicles didn't have enough power in those days to pull a heavy truck or heavy vehicle out of the mud because it's slick and difficult to deal with. And in fact, a famous American general, a Marine Corps general, his name is Old Duckboard, Smedley Butler, who won 2 Medals of Honor, a major general retired in the Marine Corps, was famous for putting these into to trench lines. Introduced, other people did it also, but Smedley Butler was well known for this, a significant contribution he made. So saying Marines were able to deal with mud, that's not only something we know now, but it's true even in the past. Well, hopefully, are there any Marines in the audience? Well, we won't say more about Marines. The problems that we had from Asian influence, the Chinese bringing this, most flus do arise in China, and the problems in northern France were exacerbated by the American evolution of the disease. In 1918, in February, mid-February, a Dr. Miner, Hiram Miner, in Haskell County, a local physician and also the public health officer, additionally to his private practice, noticed the flu that year being more pernicious, more contagious than had been in the past. And it was so significant, he notified the national health authorities in Washington. They thought that Miner was being overly pessimistic, that because Haskell County in western Kansas was not very densely populated, this would essentially burn itself out. That is, the flu would be contagious throughout the population, get to a significant percentage of the population. Those are the people susceptible. They would get well or die, whatever would happen. The herd immunity would then exist in that population. The flu would go away. That maybe it's a little worse, but not something to worry about. Now, from a larger perspective at the time, people are always picking on Washington, having been a Washington bureaucrat in the past. I think I have to come to their defense, although this will be the only time I will do that. Measles, which was much more deadly than flu, there was a measles epidemic in the United States at the time. If you're putting together an army and you're mobilizing the country, you're worried about the most significant threat. Measles was considered by people looking at the situation in February of 1918 as much more significant. So they thought, fine, we have Miner's report, but we're not going to worry about it. Well, it appears as though 6 men from Haskell County were inducted into the United States Army. And of course, the Army, being an effective, efficient organization, wants to induct people as close to home and train them as possible. These men were inducted into Camp Funston in Kansas on present-day Fort Riley, one of the three significant camps at Fort Riley. And 56,000 men were brought into Camp Funston for training in 1918. 6 came from Haskell County. 6 days after those men came in, the first person, Albert Getchell, came down with flu-like symptoms. Now, unfortunately, Getchell in civilian life had been a butcher. Once again, the Army is effective and efficient. So where would you put a butcher in the Army if you inducted him? You would put him as a cook's assistant right away because he knew how to handle meat. Therefore, he is touching not only the food, but he is touching all of the implements. So 6 days later, the 4th of March, he comes down, goes on sick call. In 24 hours, and he was very, very sick. 24 hours later, over 100 men had come down with these flu-like symptoms. Now, the flu comes in 3 waves. There's the 1918, April, the beginning. By the time we're getting many of those troops who had been infected to Europe, the flu had mutated. So the fall of 1918 and the second wave in 1919 were much more virulent. The disease not only spread faster and further, but it was more serious. We were developing symptoms that looked very much to civilians like the Black Death, and many people said the Black Death has come back. Doctors changed that and said, okay, we'll buy the Blue Death. And the reason for this is that the lack of oxygen in the lungs, because they fill with fluid so fast, turned patients very dark. So dark that some doctors said you couldn't tell Black soldiers from white soldiers. Pustules developed from these literally explosions in the lungs of material that went through the bloodstream and into the skin, so that the skin had these small venulated pustules that actually crackled. It made the skin dry. Like the sound was similar to Rice Krispies, is how it's described. So these are things that begin to look like the Black Death of the Middle Ages, and people were starting to get very worried with the second phase. Also, the second phase was so virulent that you would get, and there are lots of reports about people dying within 48 hours. Well, in actuality, a large number of people who apparently got a heavy viral dose died within 24 hours. Some died within 12. There are stories of Army hospitals, apocryphal, where a nurse would come to work on the afternoon shift at 4 o'clock, feeling fine. She came to work. By 6 o'clock, complained of early symptoms, would literally lay down to rest. The doctors would say, oh, you have a fever. They'd put her in a bed, and by noon the next day, she was dead. So that's how fast this could happen in the second phase. The condition, the cyanosis, the darkening of the skin, meaning that clearly you were essentially starving to death of oxygen. You had no oxygen. When that began to happen midway through the second phase, we didn't have the term triage then, but the doctors and nurses would look at you. They would, wrap you up, try to keep you warm. They'd move you out into the corridor. They knew that at that point, there was nothing they could do for you. You were dying, and they needed to work on the people they could possibly save. Now, medical science had not advanced to the point we have today. And let me say this before we go into a little more of the history. We did not know what viruses were in 1918. We used the term. Dmitry Ivanovsky, a researcher in 1892, discovered that if you filtered, they had very good filters by then, if you filtered bacteriological agents out of a strained liquid from tobacco plants, that the strained liquid was still infectious and would infect new tobacco plants. So he entitled this a viral infection. That is something that moves far and fast. That was the early meaning of viral. That's 1892. So the word existed in the vocabulary. We had it in the lexicon, but we didn't know what viruses were. It was some infectious quality of a liquid. In 1926, another biological researcher determined that it was particles rather than just the liquid. There was some particle element in the infectious quality of this viral fluid, if you will. In 1931, the electron microscope, or early electron microscopes, were developed. At that point, we could see viruses, and we began to understand that these were infectious particles of a nature that perform certain operations in the cell. We didn't know for a long time exactly what those operations were, and I'll talk about that as we move on. Well, let's talk about how big this was. How serious is this? I said earlier, 500,000 people were infected. The 1918 pandemic, and by the way, I call it the 1918 pandemic and not the Spanish flu. It's not the Spanish flu. That's a misnomer that we should correct. Spain was a neutral country during the war. And of course, if you've got 15 to 20% early and eventually up to 30% of your troops affected by the flu, and remember, the civilian populations are also being affected. So your production goes down, your operations go down. Victor Vaughan, the Surgeon General of the United States in 1918, in a famous statement says that the numbers were such in the fall of 1918 that if the virus continued, civilization as we know it could disappear in a few weeks if drastic measures weren't taken. So that's the Surgeon General of the United States. He's at the very top looking at this in the country and overseas, of course, where he's responsible to the medical resources of the country dealing with the military, that's how concerned he is, that civilization as we know it within a few weeks could disappear. And I think that's a realistic assessment on his part. I don't think he was overly concerned. He was looking at the numbers that many people didn't see because this, of course, was a secret. President Wilson, who was very concerned about a man of somewhat fragile ego, I don't know if that's because he was the son of a Presbyterian minister or because he had both a PhD in political science and he was a lawyer. Maybe that made him overly sensitive, but he passed the Sedition Act in 1917 after the war started, and you couldn't criticize him. But additionally, and he's very famous for that, he puts Gompers in jail for criticizing his operations. But the reason why he passed that, the Committee of Public Information he created, the reason why he passed that act was so that you could not put out information, either as an individual or as a group, that was detrimental to the American war operations. Now, by detrimental, the head of the Newton Baker, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General at the time, all believe, and they state that truth was a matter of information that was useful. So that if you said something that was true, you could be prosecuted because that was considered detrimental to the war's efforts. This was a period where the First Amendment was it was very much under attack in the United States because political statements where you disagreed with the president could be viewed as un-American, unpatriotic, detrimental to the war. The release of statistical information that talked about the possibility of us not being able to continue and prosecute the war, either because we were losing people at home, they were not healthy enough to continue the high levels of production. We tripled the size of the American economy in the First World War. It went up 6 times in the Second World War. So war production is a really significant part of how we do things. If you said things that talked about the strategy of the United States, what it is we ought to do, you criticize Wilson's 14 points. Some said that, God only needed 10 commandments. Wilson had 14. Maybe we should reconsider, or he should reconsider exactly who he is. Things like that would be viewed as un-American and detrimental. I mean, this was a significant piece of legislation, and it did a lot to dampen how we talked about things. I tell you that to say this is called Spanish flu because the Spanish were neutral, they were not at war, and they admitted what was going on. Things were published in Spain. Now, things were bad in Spain. 8 million people in Spain contracted the virus during 1918. I mean, that's, we're talking more than 20% of the population. So 8 million people in Spain. So this is in the newspapers, it's known, people see it, it's published all over the world. They started calling it, it's the Spanish flu. Well, it's not just the Spanish flu. 675,000 casualties, there were 675,000 deaths in the United States during the pandemic. Now remember, we're a nation of 120 million people at that point in time, so 675,000. If I can put that in perspective from a military point of view, that's more deaths than occurred in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq combined. More. That's more. We've got about 630,000 with all of the wars in the 20th century combined, 675,000. That is a significant number. So you can begin to understand now why both Marshal Foch and General Field Marshal Hindenburg had to consider this illness as part of their strategic posture in 1918. If we're starting to talk about an armistice in October, when Ludendorff sends a famous note upstairs, he had an office exactly the same as Hindenburg's downstairs in northern France, where they commanded the 7 field armies on the front. They sent a note that, my dear Field Marshal, you will have to notify the civilian government that the army cannot go on for another month and a political solution must be sought. Now, Ludendorff doesn't say, because of the flu, I'm being driven by this, but he says the army can't go on. The army cannot go on. Now, he actually says that. Now, in our research so far to connect the flu with Versailles, did we have an armistice because we couldn't go on? One of the difficulties we have, for example, what I'd love to find is a personal letter from Hindenburg back home to his wife, back home to the Army General Staff, or to Hindenburg, a short note to Hindenburg, because of the flu, we can't go on. We have to reconsider our posture. We don't have that. We don't have that. We've looked, we can't find it. Unfortunately, when Ludendorff gets home, he is the progenitor, one of the principal progenitors of the stabbed in the back theory. So the minority groups in Germany, the business groups in Germany, the Social Democrats, who were a new party, they were only about 30 years old in Germany, all of these combine because the army was never defeated on the front. They combine to pull us out of the war. It's these civilian activists disloyal to the empire who've done this. So of course, if he says this, this is his principal modus operandi at the end of the war, we are probably not going to get a statement. And oh, by the way, the army couldn't fight because flu was so devastating to our personnel readiness that we were not able to go on. So we haven't found that. We're still looking. We're hoping that something will be there, or that maybe someone like Max Hoffman, who was one of the senior strategic planners, a brigadier general, who was the operations officer for the 8th and 9th Armies in the East under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, was responsible for the quick victories over the Russian army, that someone like Hoffman, who was a planner, who was tied into Ludendorff and Hindenburg's planning and operations in the East, came back with them to the West as a principal staff officer, that we would get something in their memoirs that would talk about this. But Ludendorff's insistence that Germany was stabbed in the back, it's the businessmen, it's the Jews, it's somebody. It's not the German army. He is looking for a scapegoat somewhere to blame. We're probably not going to find the smoking gun that I'm actually looking for, but we are starting to find some of the numbers that demonstrate what the readiness was like and how significant this was. Well, so we're at Fort Riley. It's the 4th of March. Poor Albert Getchell comes down. He's sick. Within 24 hours, we've got 100 people on sick call. Let's talk about the circumstances that existed in 1918. We're at war. We are mobilizing a large force. We are sending approximately 250,000 men a month beginning in June to Europe in 1917. So we've mobilized our shipping, we've mobilized our military, we're building camps all over the country. Remember I mentioned in Europe the 1917, 1918 were bad winters. Well, there were also difficult winters in the United States. Camp Funston, where there were 56,000 people in training, many were in tents, in temporary housing. We were building barracks, but there weren't quite enough barracks to house everyone inside. Because of the weather, the post commander decided he wanted to protect the men from getting sick, from being exposed. So he took all of the men out of tents and he put them into the barracks that then existed, which could cover, given the regulations for how much space there was, living space per man, he had to violate that regulation and double them up. He did this out of humanitarian compassion. Let's get them inside where it's warm. The worst thing he could possibly have done. He put these men together so they're coughing and sneezing on each other. So what would have been a rather virulent pestilence at the time now goes to pandemic proportions inside these barracks at Camp Funston. Now, remember these men, that's their basic training. These men go other places for their training. They go off to artillery school, they go off to infantry school, they go off to cavalry school, they learn quartermaster things, they go off to all over the country. These men were sent on trains under contract to various places. And part of the contract when you move these men is that the railroad has to hire local restaurants and cafeterias or hire cooks and feed these men when the trains stop. These are steam trains, they stop, they need water, the men have to be fed. If you look at the spread of the disease in the spring and summer of 1918, everywhere the trains stopped and the men were fed, you had outbreaks spiking of the disease within about 2 weeks. So the contracted businesses that where the men were marching down, a block away from the depot and fed, or around the depot where food was brought in, containerized, and these men were fed, those towns were the hot spots that spread the disease out. To tell you we weren't very smart, we didn't learn from this, and let me skip off for a year and a half. When the men came back to the United States, we did the same thing when they were returned. So sick men went on to ships. Some died while on the ships. We would get them back to the deep water ports, Houston, Boston, Baltimore, New York, New Jersey. We would bring them back and they would be shipped to various places on trains. And the same thing happened on the return. We respread the disease. That's significant because now the disease is not only, it's more virulent, it's much more virulent. So we've got more people with it so that we're able to spread faster. We didn't have the concept in those days of super spreaders, but we probably had those going on as well. So the disease spreads, the Army spreads. You might call it the Army flu. That might have been appropriate. The three major cities in the world where we had what we would call super outbreaks are Brest in France, Boston in the United States, and Freetown in Liberia, a major transshipping point going around the world as we were moving these fleets. So conditions, what were they? We had approximately 10 million men under arms at any given point. Now, there are more people who were in the military over the course of the war, but at any given point, we had approximately 10 million on both sides. So we've got a lot of people in the world concentrated in one place on the Western Front. They are lined up from the Swiss border, seven field armies on the German side, five French field armies, eventually 2 American armies numbering about 1 million apiece, and 5 British armies, 1 in reserve, 4 on the front. So we had these massed armies on the front, in trenches, people concentrated, living conditions in their training back home where they came from, put them together very close. At Camp Funston, we have them doubled up in barracks. So we have that condition. Now we have many more people traveling. We put more than 1 million men within a year into the European theater. They went through the city of Brest, which is one of those hot spots that I mentioned. American hospitals in Brest would unload the sick who came off the ships. They'd have dead, of course, they would have sick. And as soon as these men, the ones who were feeling better, or if they weren't so sick, they needed to be hospitalized, because General Pershing needed these men on the front, the French and the British were pressuring us to put troops in the field as fast as possible. At one point, if we said we had to slow down, said, okay, then spread those troops around in the other armies. We'll take your areas of responsibility. Pershing refused, and he would speed up the Americans coming forward because he wanted to keep the American army in the field under American command, the 2 corps and eventually 3 corps that we had in that first army. And then, of course, later as the second army began to arrive. Because of that, many of these men who were not feeling well, but they were ambulatory, they were able to walk, but they were still sick, they were pushed up to the front. Well, that, of course, spread the disease even more among the American army, and that spread it off to our allied forces because we were working together, going through their area, living in their civilian areas in the rear of France. We arrived Brest, mid-south, went up north, and of course, all the places we went through, once again, just like back in the United States, we spread this out along the railroad and the road lines. This went across the lines to the German army. They were able to pick this up in significant numbers. And of course, British and German and French soldiers went home on leave. They had rest periods. They would go back home. You get a week off or 2 weeks or whatever it was. They went back and spread this among the population. Now, that's how we spread it, at least on the Western Front. I won't deal with the rest of the world, but that's what happens on the Western Front. Now, let's look for a moment at the conditions right on the battlefield itself. We've talked about the crowded conditions, the training, the concentration of people, transportation, they're crowded in large groups. What's the battlefield like? Well, we have a stagnant war for 3.5 years of the 4.5 years of the war, that people are in these trench lines. And the trench lines I mentioned were very wet. This is colder and wetter, 17 and 18, than the previous 50 years. The ground is chewed up in no man's land, as I said, by artillery, and for miles behind the trench lines. Well, soldiers would remain after the war had gotten underway and regularized, if you will. Soldiers would remain approximately 2 weeks to 30 days on the trench line. Then they would rotate back, be rested, other soldiers would fill in. We call this, the military term is called refusing the lines. That is, we replace a unit with a fresh unit in the same area. We don't increase the operational tempo or capability, we just replace the troops. So one division replaces another division. The area they were going into was literally infected ground. The ground was, if you will, a petri dish for disease. If we put phosgene and chlorine gas into the air, soldiers are really happy when it rains because it washes this crap out of the air. They can take off their rubber suits and their gas masks. Well, when you do that, of course, the phosgene, chlorine go into the ground, the soup, if you will. We change the pH of the ground. We make it much more available for bacteria. Now, where does the bacteria come from? We have human waste, urine and feces, because these men are in one place for 2 weeks, so they can't go very far to dig their latrines. The ground is chewed up, so water flows through the ground much faster. These are extraordinarily wet periods of time. The ground is chewed up with the artillery, and you have dead bodies in no man's land that are decomposing. All of this washes into the trench. One of the things we discovered in World War I is this new disease that we call trench foot. Now, there have always been issues. Junior officers in military since time immemorial, one of their responsibilities is you make sure your men have dry boots, dry, clean socks. You want them to change. That foot diseases will slow down or stop an army if they're significant. And typically you can, change your socks, keep them dry, things are okay. I see some of you smiling. I am sure you've been, if you were in the military, that as a junior officer, that's one of the things that you had to do. You had to worry about your men's feet. So you sort of became like a mother. Like, are those feet clean? Have you washed your feet? Have you got dry socks? Did you change your boots? Those sorts of things. Well, even when you did that in World War I, the biological infestation in this water in the trenches was so virulent that literally right through the boots, right through the socks, even though you had a shower, the week before, you come on the line for 2 weeks, you're standing in this foul water, you get these fungal diseases of the foot that we can't stop. Many men not only had toes and feet amputated, but even legs, because the doctor couldn't stop the infection once it got started. If it really got a good hold on you, this took people out of the war. I mean, this was significant. Well, that's that biological soup. So imagine we've got you crowded, you are cold, you're wet, you're in this biological soup, this ground that is just seething with contagion, and we hold you there, and we have this new infection that shows up. So if you get sick, of course, you have lower resistance to the flu. If you get sick, if you're wounded, I shoot you with a .30 caliber bullet through your dirty shirt. You fall down onto the ground, and this ground touches you. This biological soup that you're living in now has a way to invade the body. So that's the conditions in which people lived in World War I. Okay, so we have that. Now let's look at who got sick, and there were some unusual things about this. The susceptibility of the morbidity rates of the troops were very interesting, and of the general population. The group most affected were those between 25 and 29. The second most affected, 30 to 34, third, 20 to 24, prime military age, and finally 34 to 44. Now, above 44, the infection rate was rather low. And below 20, below 19, the infection rates are very low. Now, this is interesting because in a normal flu year, we consider the people who are weak to be those who are young, very young, children, babies, and of course the elderly, which may have some pre-existent condition, particularly of the lungs or circulatory system. They're considered susceptible to flu. This particular flu actually went after people of military age. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Now, what we think theoretically is there were pandemics throughout the 19th century that put a certain amount of herd immunity into the population, 1830, 1847, and 1889. And there were major, and these were mostly N1 type infections. So we had N1 antibodies in the population until this point in time. And of course, I won't get into the virology of this, but one of the interesting things about the flu virus, we think that it originates prehistorically within the avian population. That's where the N1 comes from. Then it's able, because it mutates, to transfer to mammalian populations. And in parts of the world like China, like Haskell County, birds and pigs are very close together. And horses also, at this point in time, there were a lot more horses that were more distributed, more evenly distributed in the population. Now horses are on farms, they're on horse farms, they're around racing stables, things like that. But horses, remember, were everywhere in the 19th century. There was a zoodemic in 1872 that starts in Toronto. It was so significant as it spread into the United States. By the middle of the 1880s, the Apaches, who were considered by many the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen, the Cheyenne, I understand, argue with that. The Apache in Arizona and the U.S. cavalry were fighting each other on foot because their horses and mules were so sick, their herds so denuded, they could not muster companies of cavalry to be deployed in the field to fight the Apache. So both sides, that's how significant this was. This is the same virus. That's 1872. So that mutates, goes back into the human population in 1889, infects people, and we have, of course, herd immunity from, at that point, that would be H1N4. Well, what happens then is that we don't have another significant flu outbreak until 1918. We have the annual flu, but it's not particularly bad. So if you were born before 1889, very likely you had some herd immunity to the flu. If you're born after 1889, that is, you would be 25 to 30 to 35 years of age in 1918, you had no protection. So the flu is now able to attack this particular group, young, healthy, which we don't expect to get flu, in a much more virulent situation. Well, I've got a little bit more material here. That's only the first page, and I think I've got 4 pages of notes. Why don't we stop and we can do some questions? That's 40 minutes. I suspect there are probably some questions on the military side, what this means. And then we can get into the virology. We can talk about 1830, 1847, 1889, what happens and how it changes. And I see my friend Dr. Olbrich down there in the corner rubbing his beard. So I know he's got probably a question I'm not going to be able to answer on the science.
Okay, great. Thanks, Professor. Yeah, let's take some questions. I'm going to unmute Sal as well.
Sal is never muted.
So we're a bigger group. So let's see. The best way to do this, I think, is if you would just you should be able to unmute yourself. You can do that by either going to your little portrait and at the top right-hand corner, you should have your different audio and video settings. Or if you're using a keyboard, if you hold down the space bar, you just press it down, that should also unmute you. So if you do have a question, maybe if you could just wave your hand, and Professor, you should be able to see, I guess, about a third of the group at any one time.
think I can
So
see
we'll
7 people.
You can be, okay. So you're in the speaker view. Okay. I can see
Did
more
I change
people.
that?
So yeah, you can change that. If you go to the top, if
Now
you
I
go to
only
the
see
top
you.
right. Okay. If you go to the top right and you put in gallery view, that'll open up everybody.
Okay.
And so you can unmute yourself and wave your hand. You also, yeah, let's try it that way and see if it works. There's a kind of digital hand, but sometimes that can be a little bit awkward. So let's try it.
Let me say something first, Melanie.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
And Professor, I have a double thing. I'm overimpressed by his clarity and his brilliance and details, everything else. And secondly, I'm impressed by the number of people who are joining us. So I'm very pleased that this very first experience on Zoom is being very well handled. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Professor.
Yes, sir.
I have a comment here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, is this who
Richard
is this? Sorry.
Brewer, I'm calling, yeah, from Michigan. I have a family history on this flu. My father and his twin brother were born November 28th, 1918. Their mother was from Belgium. The family had left Belgium in 1910, basically, so her brothers wouldn't get killed in the war. Anyway, her sister wants to come over and see the twins. And my grandmother says, nobody gets to see the twins. Nobody gets to come in the house. And so 6 weeks later, her sister's husband died. He was 26 years old and left a widow with 3 children. So the only thing that saved my father and his twin brother was their mother's not letting anybody come in. So they were aware in 1918 that this was out there.
Well, no, I can very well understand that. You might also consider the principal means of dealing with infection are exactly the same now as they were in 1918.
Yeah.
Social distance, wearing a mask. Those are the same as they were in the 1460s when the Black Death came into Europe the second time. They knew enough to know you needed distancing, and they covered their faces. The medical science deals with, after you have the disease, we can deal much better now, which is why we don't have the morbidity rates, the mortality rates that they had in 1918, given that we're very close. We're now at about 1.8, 1.9% infection rate with the current disease, with COVID. And the flu then was 2.8, 3.3. The second wave was very high, but it wasn't 3.3 all the way across, but that's the worst we had. In Philadelphia, on September 23rd, 1918, there was a bond march, a large parade to support the soldiers' war bonds. They were warned by the health authorities not to do it. The politics of the time, it's not patriotic to put this away. 2 weeks later, literally, Philadelphia shut down. They lost eventually, over about 12 weeks, they lost 14,000 people in Philadelphia. They got the message. If we can compare now with then, Los Angeles shut down, ordered masks, social distancing about 12 days after San Francisco. Los Angeles opened up 8 days before San Francisco. They had 4 times the deaths, and they were roughly the same size. Sounds almost like today. San Francisco was much more careful, shut down sooner, and reduced the infection rate. Los Angeles seemed to be pushed by its business community. The Mayor Garcetti didn't seem to defend himself very well, succumbed to that, and then, of course, opened up the beaches and other things in Southern California. And we can see the difference between the two areas today, looking very much like they looked 100 years ago. I mean, isn't that interesting? We've learned so little. But yes, your mother did the right thing. Your mother did the right thing. Yes, sir.
Professor Armstead, Dr. Bob Hartman, Amador County. I'm the Deputy Public Health Officer here in Amador County. That's
so you're responsible
absolutely
for protecting me.
Yeah, hey, yeah.
I live in Pioneer.
Exactly. So, and plenty of masks if you need them. But a couple of questions.
I want an antibody test, by the way. I think I had this in January.
Well, and there's a substantial portion of the region here who thinks they had it. And actually, we've been trying to track the antibody tests and what percentage of them have come back positive. And it's really been very, very low for those people who had a significant flu-like illness in December, January, February. So in antibody tests, I think are still, it's sort of the Wild West. So we don't really know exactly how to interpret them, what kind of protective shield they give you, if any. And I think the only reason to do antibody testing now is if you were COVID positive at some point and you are willing to donate your
Yes.
plasma. And I think that's a real legitimate reason. We're going to know more about it later. We know so little about this virus, but two questions. One, your approach from a geopolitical standpoint was absolutely fascinating in terms of what was happening in the early 20th century there. And we're still early in this. So first question is, what geopolitical, besides possibly our election in this country, what global geopolitical situations or results do you think will happen with coronavirus? That's question number one. And number two, stepping back to the early 20th century, what finally made the 1918 influenza go away?
Well, let me deal with the first question first. What do I think will happen? There has been, on the part of the United States, policy-wise, the Trump administration across the board has been decoupling the United States with our traditional alliances, both military, political, economic, in trying to change how we deal with the rest of the world. And I'll use the president's own words. He called his approach America First. Well, for those of you interested, obviously, in this group is in history, of course, that was the name of the isolationist group led by the father of Charles Lindbergh in the 1920s and 30s. We wanted to isolate ourselves because the war in Europe had been so terrible. 25 million people had been killed, civilian and military across the war and around the world. How do we avoid getting America involved? We will isolate ourselves. We just won't be involved. And clearly that didn't work, but that was the push. And after the Second World War, of course, we were at the very forefront of the new theory of collective security, building the Bretton Woods Agreement where we built the United Nations. Ralph Bunche, for example, an American political scientist, wrote much of the charter in San Francisco. We pushed ourselves into the world, for good, for bad in some places, but we pushed ourselves at the forefront in bringing the world together in many facets. This administration has been pulling away from that steadily. Our NATO allies are worried about us. I work in NATO. I'm supposed to have on Fulbright the NATO Studies Chair for next year. That's been put off until January from September, and who knows, maybe further after that. And I've been working principally in Eastern Europe for the last 30 years or so. I was on the team that negotiated 14 of the new 15 states into NATO. So I looked at the world from that point of view. I'm appalled at what we're doing. I can see the disconsolation, the disequilibration, the uneasiness that's happening around the world, because the Americans, who I guess the British said, you can always count upon the Americans to do the right thing once they've tried everything else, that's not going to be in the equation if we continue down this road. Now, I think a new administration, Democrat or Republican administrations, this has been bipartisan American foreign policy for a long time, since 1946, would change that. So I do see the decoupling stopping because of this, because we've realized it's one world. that there are no borders for viruses. They go everywhere. Right now, there's a new flu, a new strain of serious flu developing in China. The Chinese have told us about this right away. They're not hiding this, they're getting this out because they received a lot of criticism about not making this clear right away. I guess Dr. Li was silenced, the first man who identified that this was something new, and he dies of this, taking care of his patients. He contracts the disease, dies himself, that now many people in the Chinese medical community are considering him a hero, as they should, in my opinion. So the Chinese have modified at least the transparency issue. Our pulling back from the World Health Organization, and I love this. I mean, in terms of optics, we have this disease. First, we say it's political, it's made up, it doesn't exist. It becomes, as it becomes more, it moves into the society, and the death rates, the mortality rates go up because we haven't dealt with the things we can do to stop the morbidity. As those begin to happen more, we then back out of the World Health Organization. So the very organization designed to give us more information that we're able to work with, does it need reform? Absolutely. But instead of giving them more money or getting more American influence, more influence with our allies to change it, what we do is we back away. That to me makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Now, that first question. The second question, I'm not sure I can really give a very good answer to that, other than to say, as you say, I'll echo your words, this is so early that it's early in the science that we don't know. For example, if I had this in January, I see my friend Dave Sherlock sitting in the audience. He heard me give a speech the third week after I had whatever I had, whispering with spraying phenol in my throat. I could talk for 10 minutes with a spray of phenol, just god-awful tasting stuff, but it worked for about 10 minutes. I could talk. I was described as being 10% of my normal self. And I gave the speech twice during the day, once at 2, once at 7. But I then went to bed for like 4 days and could hardly move. But I did do this. It's so early in the disease that I think the science is still out as to what we have. As you said, the idea of immunity, I think the correct term, as my friend Dr. Olbrich at the bottom of the screen here would say, presumed immunity is all we can talk about at this point, because we don't know if you have any immunity, and then if it's permanent, as it is with some other flu viruses, until they mutate just enough that they can still get back in and denude the cells. So I'm not sure we can talk about the policy until we really know the science. I think one of the things that we've seen in America, and there was a wonderful illustration the other day on the news where there was a woman in Texas, an old woman, elderly, probably younger than I am, but in her 60s or 70s, screaming at a reporter, calling her a terrorist. You're wearing a mask, you're a terrorist, you're frightening us, you want the deep state to take over. I think what we've got, and I've said for years, when we've done a lousy job with civics education in the United States, I had no idea we'd done such a lousy job with science. That if people understood the science, you wouldn't have them arguing about wearing a mask. You wouldn't have them arguing about staying home. You wouldn't have these long arguments about opening up schools, opening up factories. My friend Dr. Olbrich at the bottom of the stage, I'll quote him again, 6 feet is during the close down period. You need to stay 6 feet as you're passing people on the street or a line. If you go back to work, 6 feet's not enough if you sneeze or cough. That you are spreading droplets of particulate matter around the room much further than 6 feet. So we're going to have to revise the way we look at this, depending upon the infection rate as it continues until there's a vaccine, which is at least a year away, if not more. Now, does that help a little bit? And that's certainly a layman's answer. We don't know enough about the science to really determine the policy.
Oh, thank you. I think you're absolutely hit the nail on the head. Our scientific information, although there are reams of it coming out every single day, we still know very little about this, and it's
yeah, this is new. And by the way, I want to be in touch with you.
We have a question from Len. I see, Len, you have your digital hand up. If you could unmute yourself. Go ahead, Len Myers.
How do I see Lynn, by the way, Melanie?
So if you don't see him on your first screen, you might be able to see him on the second screen. If you move your, if you go to the far right hand, you can see an arrow that comes up. You can move to the second screen. We have so many people here that not everybody is on one screen, which is
Okay,
great.
I won't try to do that then. I'll screw something up.
Okay, I see him though. So Len, go ahead.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Professor. That was a wonderful and informative and detailed presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And my question was prompted by some of the parallels you drew between today's pandemic and what happened with the pandemic back in 1918. My question goes to the war production in the country. You mentioned that the economy grew by a factor of 3. I'm wondering what was the balance between public health and war production as it related to factories and things of that nature, the industrial complex producing the material that was needed, juxtaposed against trying to minimize or mitigate spread among the population, particularly those who are working in for war production.
I can't give you a full and complete answer on that because I don't know all of the circumstances, but I can tell you this. We started wearing masks. We started with social distancing. It got to the point where, for example, the mayor of New York, remember I mentioned Philadelphia, the politicians ignored what their doctor said. The mayor of New York was caught at a ball game without a mask, and he was charged $5. He got a fine, and it was $5, which he had to pay. And there's a picture in the newspaper of a policeman with a mask in his hand, willing to hand him and writing him the ticket. So, when a policeman writes the mayor of a ticket and it's, well, I don't know if it's front page, but it makes the New York Times, clearly it's significant. People recognize this is something important to reduce and eliminate the contagion. So that was happening with people on the street and in factories, and you were not able to, restaurants were closed. You weren't able to get on the public transportation on a streetcar, which was open and relatively safe if you maintained distance and wore a mask. You weren't able to get on without a mask. So I can tell you that much. What happened in each individual factory, my research hasn't gone in that direction, but that's an excellent question. I appreciate it. It's something maybe we should look at. And of course, I'd be interested in that in Germany, considering my point of view. I want to know how this got us to Versailles. Is this the critical factor? When Ludendorff wrote that note, tell the politicians they have to find another solutions, that the army can't solve this. That's the beginning of October. That's before the negotiations started for November 11th, for the armistice.
Thank you.
Professor, sorry, Len, sorry.
No,
I had a quick question to follow up about that. What was the infection rate among the German army?
We don't have a good number. It appears to be upwards of 25%, 20 to 25% and above, that we get that much because we can see who goes home and who goes to hospitals. But I think the infection rate was higher than that. Remember, even now, as Dr. Bob pointed out, we're getting reams of data, but we haven't collated the data in any sense of dealing with big data. We've got to put our big computers on this, get all of the data as this goes on in the next 6 months, put it together. We can start drawing conclusions from looking at trends. We don't have enough of that yet. And we've got, until we start antibody tests, we don't know what the real infection rate is. We know who gets sick enough to go to the hospital. Well, I would argue you don't really need a test if a guy shows up. He can't breathe, he's coughing, sneezing, he's got a temperature of 103, and we have to wheel him in a gurney. That I know he's got something, we need to work on it. We get him in, we can look at it, and we can certainly make the tell. What we need to know is who out in the population, asymptomatic, has this, because they may still be spreading. We don't know what's the ability of an asymptomatic person to spread. We don't know that yet. What percentage? We do know things, for example, if you're in a room with someone a normal sized workroom, living room, you're in a room with someone and you're unmasked and they are positive, you've got roughly a 75% chance of catching the disease. If you wear a mask, that reduces your rate of infection to about 35%. If both of you have a mask on, it reduces it to 3%. That information ought to be front page in every newspaper in the United States. If I were still in office, still work for the government, I would make sure that's out. And by the way, I got that information from my friend Patty Sherlock, who I see down in the corner there. So people send me, I get things from all over that people are sending me that we try to keep up with. But some of that information needs to be spread around. I mean, those numbers we've gotten, and those are early numbers. Now that may change as we know more. That one of the things, this is a moving target.
Still, that's incredible. The drop in potential infection rate is.
And we need to offer that to people, for example, who go to political rallies in Oklahoma City, or people standing around in Texas in front of news stations, throwing stones verbally at members of the press wearing masks, calling them terrorists. Our education, our science education has failed us in the country, much as our civics education.
Any other questions for the professor? I see, okay, Gary, and I think several of you, I know I see you don't have your video on, so if you could either send a question through the chat, or you can raise your digital hand. If you go to the top right hand of your little screen, you should be able to raise your digital hand. But I do see a real hand from Gary. So
hi,
hi, go ahead.
Hi, actually, this isn't Gary. This is Rebecca.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
It's his laptop. So,
yes, okay.
One of the last things you said was related to a question I'm asking. And in 1917, 18, did people trust science, and did they trust what doctors and elected officials said? And is there I don't understand how we got to that problem here, where people saying, you're terrorizing us by wearing a mask. It's just something I can't grasp, thinking that someone is.
Oh.
So was it like that back then, and is it like that now? And how did they deal with it back then? And how do we help people to understand it's terrifying, except if you wear your masks and stay 7 feet away, it's much better. I want some clarification on how to keep.
Okay, I think my comments here would be, you're asking two questions. The back then question, the now question. The now question, at least as I understand it from the people who are anti-mask, is that they have a understanding of freedom in our social context, meaning you can do anything you want to do no matter what. And that was never an understanding of freedom. St. Paul says you are free to obey the law. You are free to obey the law. It comes from St. Paul. Now, your freedom is balanced. Your freedom to extend your arms in two directions stops when you get to my nose. There was always a social compact that Voltaire and Montesquieu talk about, that we come together as a society where people must interact with each other to be productive, to be developed, to be, if you will, civilized. We have to have certain respect that allow us to operate with each other without coming into unnecessary conflict. That's a balance between total freedom. Now, that's on a continuum. Some people are going to see that as I'm free, for example, if I own land, I'm free. I spent 7 years in Nevada, University of Nevada, and the sagebrush revolution. On my land, I'm out in the desert, I can do anything I want to do. And if it creates poison, if it creates toxic circumstances, as long as it doesn't flow off my land and hurt anybody else, I'm free to do that. Then there's the view of freedom that we are in a bubble together, sort of the spaceship Earth, if you will, or the good ship America, if you will, where I have to act a certain way in response to my fellows that I share this space with, and I owe them something. I owe them my tax money, I owe them my goodwill, I owe them my participation. whatever. So there's a continuum, is how you might look at freedom. We are getting people who think if you believe that there's a mass conspiracy, the deep state, that any sort of forcing of conformity, like everyone will wear a mask, everyone will stay 6 feet apart, you can
Against
only
my
go to a
rights.
restaurant and fill 1/3 of the tables, that they feel that that's too much imposition on their freedom. That's now. Now, going back to 1918 and making a comparison, I feel that you made an interesting comment that do we respect the opinions and the orders of our politicians, our medical people? First of all, our medical people and our politicians are not in lockstep. That medical people and politicians, just like 100 years ago, view this very differently. I am sure that there are two medical people I know who are on the screen I can see. I'm sure they have got opinions about either the lack of understanding you get from our political authorities or the slowness in them responding to the information that's there. That we have the comment from Dr. Bob that this is a new disease, we're still learning things. One of the things that we have to understand, as we learn things, that will change what we do. It'll change our decisions. Back to Helmut Bernard Karl von Moltke. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Whatever our rules are, whatever our policies are, whatever our modus of operation are with dealing with this disease publicly, that may change. It may become stricter. We may loosen in certain areas as we begin to understand. The science isn't a fixed set of rules that somebody hands you and says, this is an immutable fact that will never change. It's our ability to understand, learn, and appreciate the universe around us. We learn new things every day.
So thank you. Nothing to learn from experiences on how people turned around and wore their masks back in 1918, right?
I think we're learning that we don't learn fast enough.
We're still slow. We're still stubborn.
And
Thank
we have to
you.
respect science.
Exactly.
Other questions? Let me just see if I see any hands popping up. Don't see any hands, I don't think. Or you can
So
unmute yourself as well and you want to speak. Go ahead, Professor. I do see.
We can
Yeah.
talk about, H1N1 in 1830, H1N8 in 1847, or H3N8 in 1889, and how the N factors put antibodies in. But I think Sal probably wants to close somewhere around here. So Sal, if I've done what you wanted.
I think he's muted. Let me ask
Sal,
him to
you're
unmute.
muted.
While I do that, we do have one more question from Len. So Len, go ahead and I'll unmute Sal and we can
And
go
I
from
could
there.
see Lynn after a few moments before that you did
Oh.
something. I didn't do anything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Professor, I actually came across a very informative article a couple of months ago that looked at the flu of 1918 and some of the parallels between then and now. One of those was the fact that many men at the time, from a cultural standpoint, thought it was quote unquote weak if you wore a mask. And so it wasn't so much along political party lines, but more of a masculinity perspective. A lot of men felt that they preferred not to wear a mask. And so there was an actual national campaign to try to encourage men to wear masks, not just for themselves, but to safeguard their loved ones, kind of like what you're seeing today.
Well, Lynn, that's an excellent point. Let me say this about that. Right now, we already know statistically, men are more susceptible in almost every age group to the virus than women are. Now, we're not sure why, but it may be men smoke at a higher rate. Men tend to drink more. So all of the things that tend to give you, put you in a category, making you more susceptible, men fit into those statistically at a higher rate than women. So if anything, men should be wearing masks even more to protect themselves, although the mask doesn't really protect you as much as it keeps you from spreading your own viral matter.
All right, I
But yes,
think,
that's certainly there. And I think it's true now.
can I introduce something now, please?
Yes,
Do you
sir.
hear me? Yeah, I want to thank Professor Armstead and for the people who asked the questions. I have only one apology for our local people. I didn't make any desserts for you to have, which I usually do at these meetings. But I want to thank Professor and for you, Melanie, for doing a wonderful job with this. But I think it's time for us to conclude, and we will next month have another Zoom with another topic about World War I, as it is an important issue that does not go away. So again, Professor Armstead, you are brilliant. You are a wonderful way to introduce our program on Zoom.
Could you
Thank
tell my wife that, Sal?
I will.
Could you
I
tell my wife
swear I
that?
will do that. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask Dr. Bob for his phone number before we go?
Oh, sure.
Dr. Bob? Did we lose him?
I think you might have.
Oh, well.
No, I was
Public
trying
health, I'll find
to,
him.
Professor, I was trying to unmute. Absolutely.
yes.
Anybody can have my phone number.
Sure.
My cell number is 209-256-0598. And I've met you before at the Progressive Women's Club luncheons in Jackson.
Yes, you look familiar.
Yeah, back pre-corona, we sat at the same table once or twice. And just down the hill from you a little bit, my wife and I live in Pine Grove.
Oh, okay. I have to get ice cream in Pine Grove later.
Oh,
You will be hearing from me.
We were there yesterday.
Uh-huh. You will be hearing from me, sir.
Great. Thank you so much. It was absolutely wonderful. Very informative.
Thank you. Thank you, Sal, for inviting me. And your kind comments
My
are overly
pleasure.
generous. They're quite gracious, certainly undeserved, but I appreciate it nonetheless.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thanks.
Thank you, Sal and Professor. Just real quick, I also chatted out my email address. If you had any questions about using Zoom or anything like that, please email me. And the professor did send some links to me to share about
Yes.
further resources about the topic. So I'll coordinate with Diane and we'll get those links out to all of you. And Sal, I think the next meeting is August 8th. Is that correct?
That's correct. It'll be Saturday, the 8th of August, again at 10:30 Pacific Standard Time. All
So
right.
we'll be sure to send a link out at that before then, so you can
Oh,
all
yes.
join again.
Yes, we will. We always will. I want to thank you all for being a part of this, and we learned a great deal. So have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you very much, and thank you above all, Professor Armstead, for a more than brilliant presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.